In this section, we're going to be talking in detail about the first type of defensibility, network effects. So you know that growth wins, the game has changed, and we need a different approach. And we talked about how that different approach is by constructing a sustainable, repeatable, and systematic growth engine. Sitting at the center of this growth engine are the three inputs into growth: retention, engagement, monetization, and acquisition. We talked a lot about how we bring these three components together in the construct of growth loops, both from the acquisition as well as the retention perspective. A growth loop is much more defensible than a surface level acquisition tactic because it combines our unique elements of product, channel, and model into one system. But an acquisition or a habit loop on its own is not defensible over the long term. So we need to think about how we build defensibility into our distribution over time. Defensibility is how these underlying growth loops connect together to accelerate over time. In other words, what is kind of that macro loop kind of sitting on top of these other underlying components that makes the underlying components more sustainable over time? These four different forms of macro loops or defensibility are network effects, brand, embedding, and scale. Let's introduce network effects in a little bit more detail. We can think about network effects as a macro loop, and every network effect has the same underlying concept that as adoption increases, the value to the users increases, which brings in more adoption over time. We talk about network effects first and in more detail because they look like they're the most important form of defensibility in tech companies. James Currier, the founder and managing partner at NFX, has done a massive research study looking at all of the tech companies that have either been acquired or gone public over the past 20 years and found that while only 20% of tech companies had strong network effects, they accounted for over 70% of the value creation. And that's why we find network effects sitting at the center of companies like LinkedIn, Slack, Amazon, Airbnb, Uber, and Shopify. The thing about network effects, though, is that they're commonly thrown around as a term, but very misunderstood. The most common misunderstandings around network effects start with thinking about how network effects and virality are the same thing. Virality and network effects are not the same thing. They are two completely separate things. Virality is a concept of a loop where one user helps acquire another user. A network effect is as more users adopt the product, the value of the product increases, which helps bring in more users. Now, there's companies that have one or the other as well as both. We could think about BuzzFeed as a company that has strong virality and grew off the back of virality, but has very low to no network effects. Whereas Airbnb has a lot of network effects, but has pretty low viral loops. And somebody like Slack that has a combination of both. They have strong viral loops as well as strong network effect loops. It's important to distinguish virality and network effects from each other because they have different benefits, KPIs, and most importantly, growth levers and strategies of how you actually implement them. While virality helps one user help acquire another user, and we've seen in companies like BuzzFeed and Rovio that helps accelerate growth and lower CAC in measured via K-factor. Network effects, on the other hand, is where the value of the product increases as more people use it. And we see it in companies like Airbnb, Google Search, Salesforce. And the major benefit of network effects is that they provide defensibility through distinct acquisition, retention, monetization advantages. We measure network effects through Metcalfe's law, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in more specifics. The second common misunderstanding of a network effect is that all network effects are created equally. In fact, we can look at different network effects and plot them out on a chart such as this, where the y-axis is the value to users and the x-axis is the users or usage. We'll go through the different types of network effects and how we can see this type of value grow in a linear fashion, an asymptotic fashion, or a delayed or exponential fashion. The third common misunderstanding around network effects is that network effects happen randomly. But in fact, building network effects is actually a methodical strategy and not something that randomly occurs. The general order of operations around building any type of network effects is figuring out how do you constrain the initial audience to make the density of the network effect easier, then finding a hook to basically kick off and accelerate the time to density, and then taking that accelerated time to density and leveraging that into the next audience and repeating the steps of the loop. So understanding network effects actually comes down to 3 different things. The first thing that we'll go through are the different types of network effects and how they are different from each other. We'll then specifically talk about how network effects impacts growth in those underlying inputs into our growth model: acquisition, monetization, retention, and engagement. We'll then walk through in more detail about how you approach building a network effect step by step over time. In the next lesson, we're going to kick off and go a little bit deeper on the different types of network effects.